today's episode, I have the privilege of sitting down with Betsy Butterick. Now, Betsy is a coach's coach and communication specialist who helps build high-performance teams and cultures where everyone can thrive. Today is such an important conversation because today we actually talk about how to effectively coach Gen Z athletes. And Betsy will dive into some of her research. She just released a new course. And we're not going to just talk about what are the defining characteristics of Gen Z. What we do is actually talk about how can we as coaches build better trust? How can we build more accountability? How can we build better communication and really connect with our kids? And most importantly, how can we create better alignment with everyone involved in our athletic department, with coaches, with athletes, and with parents alike? So sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Betsy Butterick. Betsy Butterick, welcome to the Being Champions podcast.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, Betsy, I was actually really excited. We connected, 3 years ago on the Way of Champions conference. And then we had the opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation about championship communication. So for me, when I was forming this podcast and thinking about guest speakers, you immediately came to mind because these past 3 years, you honestly have been one of my favorite people to learn from. You just make learning stick. I love your ACT videos. I love your blog, the work you do with JP Nurbanow and Nate Sanderson on the Coaching Culture podcast. So I'm just excited you're here, but I was wondering if you could kind of kick off and share with our listeners some of your background from coaching college basketball to now this new platform you're on as a coach's coach.
Yeah, absolutely. I was an athlete through college and got right into college coaching. I started at Stanford University and then was at the University of Washington a year in the WNBA with the Seattle Storm, Occidental College for 4 years, UC San Diego for 3 before stepping off the court to do the work that I do now full-time, which is working with coaches as an executive coach and also working as a communication specialist with athletic departments and teams. So because communication is a broad topic, I get to do a lot of interesting kinds of works within teams or within organizations. And because communication is a skill, it's something that anyone really at any time can become better at or more practiced at or find ways to optimize this thing that we do all the time. But most of us spend very little time being intentional about how we do it, except in moments that really matter.
Yeah, I love that. And just hearing you talk about that, one, I love the fact, and I feel like this is a new trend where coaches really need coaching, right? And we always challenge our kids, like, what do you do in the off season to get better?
Right.
I need you to do X, Y, and Z. So I love this new platform you're on because we need that help too. We need those guidance. We need those mentors because for me, it really comes down to how do we create the best environment and experience for our kids? And that's why I was so excited to have you on today because I know you just released a new course on working with Gen Z athletes and how can we effectively create the best sports experience and environment. And really what I wanted to do today, Betsy, was kind of frame this conversation in 2 parts and talking about the what and then talking about the how. And I know you love to start your workshops with coaches is you challenge them by saying, all right, fill in the blank. Kids these days, ... So can you talk to our listeners a little bit about what have you found, like the defining characteristics of Gen Z, and what are some of the challenges coaches come to you? So when you challenge them, when they say kids these days, what are some of the things you're hearing?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I can repeat all of them on this podcast,
Right.
but I hear a lot of, if I had to summarize, I'd say I hear a lot more challenges than I do things that are reasons to celebrate. I hear a lot of frustration, and that's really what most of my work around Gen Z, specifically in the context of coaching, is replacing judgment with understanding. If we can understand that the world that today's student athletes grew up in, Gen Z and followed behind them Gen Alpha, the world was a very different place than previous generations. And you mentioned that podcast with JP and Nate, and recently we had the opportunity to interview the lead researcher for the book, The Anxious Generation.
Yeah.
And one of the most eye-opening / scariest things that he said during that interview is, the millennials, like we are the last generation to know what a screen-free childhood was like.
Hmm.
And I think about, days when we were growing up and we were out on our bikes for hours at a time. There was no cell phones, there were no, GPS trackers, no air tags. Like our parents didn't know where we were or who we were with or what we were doing.
Yeah,
They couldn't reach us immediately if they needed to. Now we had a sense we were probably at this neighbor's house or that neighbor's house, but it wasn't just down the street. It was like a mile or two away, depending on where we ended up on our bikes.
yeah,
And so thinking about how differently kids these days not only were raised, but also the way technology influenced the world in which they grew up. And so we're seeing a translation, a shift in how kids are showing up in sport contexts. The challenge is for the coaches, unless they were or are Gen Z, not much has changed. They
yeah,
also experienced that technological shift, but because they did it at a different age, sometimes they're hard pressed to understand why kids these days are so different when they experience the same thing. They
yeah,
did, but context matters. So
yeah.
experiencing technology at a different age and the way that's influenced how Gen Z has grown up absolutely influences best practices for how we communicate and connect with them.
Yeah, I love it. And what as I hear you talk, like the biggest thing I always try to challenge our coaches with is how can we better meet our kids where they're at and not where we expect them to be. So all that stuff that you're
Yeah.
talking about, like, we're like, well, back in my day, we did it this way and we did it that way. And, we see so many different generations now, some of our older coaches, and, they've been coaching for 30, 40 years and understanding that there might be a empathy gap now and forgetting
Mm.
what it was like when we were growing up and understanding we had our set of challenges and our coaches were probably saying the same thing about us.
Yeah, how quickly we forget, right? Like I hear coaches all the time talk about kids these days being soft
Yeah.
and talking about kids these days lacking accountability or motivation or, the short attention spans, the stunted social skills. They'd rather text you about everything than have a face-to-face conversation. Just trying to understand, again, the intersection with technology and the way that's translated to different presentations of certain ways of being for today's young people.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is that a lot of times in doing this work or having conversations with coaches about best practices for working with kids these days, I have to be very clear in saying, look, I don't want you to lower your standards or expectations.
Yeah.
Because that's often the translation or the conclusion people jump to is like, oh, you just want us to be soft on kids these days because they
Yeah.
can't handle it.
Yeah.
It's like, no, actually, I think that would be doing a disservice to young people because we need to be able to teach them some of the skills that they might currently be a little more deficient in order to help them manage the way that life is really hard.
Yeah.
But if we're going to teach them, we first have to reach them. And I think that's where we sometimes miss each other is we just want them to get here where we are
Yeah.
without realizing that our best avenue for getting them to that place is by starting where they are.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean we have to sacrifice. It means that we need to understand. It means we may need to have a little more empathy, a little less judgment, and then to be really skillful about what does meeting them there look like so that we've created the relationship, the trust, the understanding to then help start to build those skills that lead towards greater resilience or lead towards their ability to handle hard things in a way that we know has value from previous generations.
Yeah, I love how you reference the teaching thing, and I strongly believe that coaches are teachers, right? And
Same.
one of my favorite lines is, a teacher will tell you where to look, but not what to see.
Yep.
So how, trying to do that, and I think this is a great time to transition now to the how part and understanding, we understand what some of the challenges our kids are facing, and just thinking about, just sports land, the new landscape now with NIL deals and the
Yeah.
professionalization of youth sports and the pressures of early specialized. Like, again, this is stuff we never had to face as coaches. So thinking about that, and I know you have this line, and this is really resonating with the past 3 years where you talk about it's not impossible,
Mm.
it's just unpracticed. It's simply
Yeah.
unpracticed. So
Yep.
thinking about that, how do we as coaches take all the stuff that we know about characteristics and the struggles, how do we actually build in more trust? How do we build accountability within our teams?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we better connect with our kids?
I think one of the easiest, I'll say, points of access for doing that, for building greater trust, for creating a relationship in which we can then have conversations, and not just conversations, but build skills around accountability, is to co-create with them. And sometimes when I say co-create, again, the translation that some ears of coaches hear is, well, you want me to just let them run the show. And that's absolutely not it. It first requires that a coach gets really clear on what their negotiables and non-negotiables are. What are the things that you as a coach or you as your staff are going to be ultimately responsible for always? And then what could you open up or invite your young athletes to co-create with you? Where can you ask for their input? Not what do they like or not like? And I think
Right.
language-wise, that's also something where I see people tipping into a slippery slope of sorts. Is I'm less concerned with what they like or don't like, because arguably I might have my team do a drill that they don't really like, but it's
Hmm.
essential for building a skill that we need to perform at our best.
Right.
So really leaning into things of, preferences, knowing that those preferences don't mean, this is the other part, expectation setting. Just because I've asked you what you prefer doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to deliver on all fronts. And I think that's a part of the conversation we often leave out when we're co-creating, even with the best of intentions. Tell me what your preferences are. Tell me how I can do this well with you.
Yeah.
But then we don't have the clarity conversation of, okay, in everything that you said, here's what we can do. Here's what is unlikely to happen. Or here's where, my input or my role as your coach or support person or educator, this is where those things align and this is where they differ. And here's what we can do about the differences.
Yeah.
So really having a very open, transparent conversation about how do we optimize this experience in the roles that we occupy, coach and athlete. How do we create this environment in which growth and learning can happen while there's also a foundational understanding and a mutual trust and respect? And even respect is different for kids these days. I mean, I was raised in a respect your elders time,
Yeah.
and that is wholly untrue for many young people today. Again, in part because of technology. A quick Google search will tell me a variety of information about an individual I've never met. And based upon the information that I read, I very quickly can make a judgment of, is this someone that I feel like I can or want to respect or not?
Hmm.
That was completely different when I was
Yeah.
growing up. We didn't have that ability. So thinking about, okay, what needs to be true in order for us as coaches to optimize the sport experience in collaboration with our student athlete? Because gone are the days where, okay, a bunch of kids are going to show up and this is the team I have and I'm just going to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way anymore. Because of technology, they've been able to customize so many elements of their world in different contexts. That same desire, although often unspoken, comes into their sport experience. And so co-creation, I think, is the easiest, most accessible thing we can start to do with young people today in order to optimize the way that we experience sport.
I love that. And again, part of the reason I wanted to get you on was, you make everything so clear and concise, and you make it sticky by using some of your acronyms. And the one that really jumps out to me, when we're co-creating and we're collaborating, let's say we're diving into our team values and our kids are kind of defining what those values mean to them. And, we're having this back and forth. I know you work into your scenarios. You talk about this AIR framework. So could you
Mm-hmm.
talk to our listeners about, as we're co-creating, as we're collaborating, once we do that, how can we actually bring this to life? When the kids define what our values are, or if the kids are defining what standards are, how do we actually bring it to life within our environment?
Yeah, great question. And I'm referring back to an Instagram post that I created after I did this activity for the first time with a college team.
Yeah.
And we were talking about leadership. So that was the context. And then the AIR acronym in the context of leadership, what I said is in successful teams, culture isn't something we talk about occasionally or work on every once in a while. Culture is the environment we create daily through everything we do. It's invisible, yet ever present, much like the air we breathe. And then using that AIR acronym, the A stands for action. And the question that I invited the group to reflect on individually is what's an action that they could take every day to demonstrate one of the leadership qualities they said was important.
Yeah.
The I in AIR was intention. So what's an intention that they can hold to make sure that that leadership quality is present in their day-to-day choices? And then the R was reflection. So how well did you demonstrate this quality today? And what shifts do you want to make, if any, in order to embody more of this quality tomorrow? So having that continual feedback cycle on an individual basis of what's the action, what's the intention, what's the reflection? Can we get really clear on those things? And then can we transfer ownership of those to our athletes?
Yeah.
Again, I hear coaches all the time talk about how frustrating it is that, players aren't accountable. But also, if we step back and look, sometimes we limit the spaces for accountability to happen. We tell them what needs to happen. We tell them why it needs to happen. That's also a big thing, leading with the why. Again,
Yeah.
relationship to
Yeah.
access to information. But we tell. We don't often ask more than we tell. We can teach in a different way when we ask instead of tell. And when we invite them to ask themselves, now we're transferring ownership. We're giving the opportunity to be accountable, to be self-led. Some of the most successful programs that I've witnessed over the past several years really are player-led.
Yeah.
And sometimes people hear player-led and they think at the exclusion of the coach. No, it's at the inclusion of the coach, but at much greater weight and pressure on the coach because they've been very clear with their athletes about what choices they have, what they're responsible for, and what outcomes will likely result based on certain choices that they make. They've given them that responsibility. They've given them that ownership. And when you do that, then you see an increase in accountability.
Yeah, I love how you brought up the telling versus asking because I think again, coaches, we love to talk, right? We're really great
Mm,
at generating feedback, but where I think we struggle is getting feedback from our kids. Like so we could provide the feedback, but we're not good at generating and getting it back. So one of the questions I remember 3 years ago you had asked is like, what can I learn from this situation? So can you talk to our listeners about how can we ask better questions as coaches and not always
sure.
doing the telling?
Yeah, and this is really a perspective shift. We first have to get out of our own way because when we know, that becomes the limiting barrier.
Yeah.
We know. And yeah,
Yeah.
you do know. You know a lot probably about your sport and you know a whole lot more about your previous experience. But many of us don't yet know as much as we could about the experience the athlete in front of us is having.
Yeah.
So thinking about, okay, what do I know in this situation? What would I likely tell or say to this athlete in the situation? And instead of telling them, what's a question I could ask to start them on that path that will ultimately lead them to the thing I otherwise would have told them directly?
Mhm.
And sometimes you need to pry a little bit. When I say pry, I mean like maybe your first question doesn't land in the way that you want it to.
Yeah.
Or maybe you need to scale back or get very specific with your questioning in order to elicit that response.
Yeah.
But there's so much more power when they say it
Yeah.
than when it comes to them from us.
Yeah.
So, base level, I would say think about the things you say often, the things that you tell athletes. Ask yourself, how could I ask a question or a few different questions that would allow them to come to the insight I would otherwise tell them, but of their own accord?
Yeah.
How can I help them get there so that now they feel like it's something they own instead of something I said?
Yeah, I love it. And you know, I know you like to teach you talk a lot about motivational interview. I've heard you talk about
Yeah.
that. So how can we be better listeners as coaches?
Mm. I think, again, a perspective shift, asking that question, what can I learn every time,
Yeah.
not only our athletes, but anybody speaking. Because the more we know somebody, the easier it is for our brain to fill in the gaps of what they're likely to do or likely to say, because we have that familiarity. So counteracting that by active curiosity, asking, what can I learn? You know, how is this individual showing up differently today than they did yesterday?
Yeah.
So really being curious is one of the ways that we can do that. Um, I think another is really starting to gauge what percentage of any conversation we spend speaking versus listening.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes what gets in the way of our listening is, as I mentioned before, we know or we think we know.
Hmm.
So really coming into any conversation with that genuine curiosity, but also with an intention to discover something new. Because if I'm actively looking for something new, for something I don't know, my ears are so much more open
Yeah.
than if I'm simply waiting to hear confirmation of what I would have said or what I already know to be true. So it's a different way to interact or engage in a conversational space. I think if you look at the ratio of speaking to listening in any conversation, if let's say an equal conversation is 50-50, as a coach, can you strive for 60-40? Can you put in more time listening than speaking? Can you elevate that and start to expand to 70-30 or 80-20?
Yeah.
Context matters always. There's going to be certain times where we need to spend the majority of the time, let's say a timeout speaking instead of listening. But there's also ample opportunities where we can flip that and spend a lot more time listening than we do speaking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, there's so much we can learn from our athletes, right? But we have to take the
Hmm.
time to actually listen and be
Yes.
curious, like you said. And oftentimes that, coaches, we love to solve problems, right? So we try to rush to
Yeah.
solve the problem rather than, again, it's about this ownership, giving our kids and giving our student athletes, allow them to work through the decision-making process and not rush to be like, okay, well, this is what I would do, solve the problem this way. And so again, it's having that curiosity and not rushing to just solve the problem. Just let your student athlete work through the issue and have them come up with the decision.
Well, and one of those challenges too in the context of coaching is time.
Yeah,
I hear coaches all the time like, I don't have the time to let them work through it, right?
yeah,
So, okay, if that's true now, let's say if I was to let them work through it, it's going to hold up the whole team and we only have so much time for practice. Okay, so put a pin in that. Be able to say to that athlete, like, hey, I want to come back to this. Right now, we need to move on to this thing, but
mhm,
remind me if I forget at the end of practice that I want to follow up here. So being able to press pause on something, because patience is one of the barriers as well. Like we
yeah,
are, part of our task as coaches is to identify what's not working and then fix it.
yeah,
And so sometimes we lack the patience or the awareness of an opportunity to exhibit greater patience in service of deeper learning.
yeah,
Because if I tell you how to fix it, that's one thing. If I teach you how to fix it, that's another. If you tell me what needs to be fixed, and then I help support you in developing tools where now you don't need me to fix the thing, that's the goal. Like, can we
yeah,
teach them what we know and transfer ownership of that knowledge to them so that they have what they need essentially to be their own coach?
yeah,
Because the reality is, with technology, the coach long ago stopped being the sole knowledge keeper of how
hmm,
to develop in their sport.
yeah,
They can hop on TikTok, they can hop on YouTube, they can find a variety of experts, probably more skilled and some even more knowledgeable than the average coach, to tell them how to get better.
yeah,
So it's no longer about the information, it's about the relationship. And that's why I'm such a strong advocate of creating that connection,
yeah,
even in the world where, NIL, kids are out there chasing the bag, like building their brand, finding the next best deal that can earn them an income from their ability to play sport. When we think about people that are monetizing sport and looking to make a buck off of a kid, what becomes even more important for that kid is who can they really trust? Like,
yeah,
who do they know has their best interest at heart, separate from how they play or perform, separate from what kind of income they could earn in partnership with that person?
yeah.
So leaning into the relational aspect of teaching, of coaching, absolutely beneficial, not just for individual success, but for long-term experience. Like, how do we want to experience the way sport has changed
Yeah.
and the dynamics involved? How do we make it fun again, not just for the kids, but for us as coaches as well?
Yeah, I love it. And two things jump in my head. The quote, people don't care how much you know until how much they know how much you care, right? And that's the thing. It's building the connection. And Steve Kerr, when he first took his job, he said the most important thing he ever did was win the relationship game, and that's at the
Mm-hmm.
professional level. And he understood
Yeah.
like no one's going to buy into Steve Kerr's tactics. No one's going to buy into his system until everyone buys into him. So taking that time to intentionally connect and show our kids we care for them beyond just being an athlete, right? And understanding
Yep.
it's person first, athlete second. And so
Yes.
I love that connection piece. And again, that's the most important thing. If we get that connection, that's how we create that buy-in with our kids. That's how we're going to get these systems rolling. But they never buy into the system; they buy into us.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, and it's a challenge because I mean, we're hired for process and fired for outcome
Yeah,
when it comes to the coaching profession. Like, tell us about your process. How would you shift the culture? How do you develop athletes? It's all about process.
yeah,
But then wins or losses dictate whether we keep that job or not.
yeah,
And what we're finding in the current context of sport too, with the access that parents and even players have to social media, to inciting investigations, like
yeah,
investigations, even though arguably maybe they should have been done a lot sooner in some contexts, like they're happening more frequently than ever before.
yeah,
So we have to recognize, you don't have to like it, but you have to recognize that the athlete voice about their experience combined with parental involvement in that experience is amplified in a way that we've never seen before.
yeah,
So then, okay, coming back to our controllables as a coach, what needs to be true in order for me to optimize that relationship so that I have not only the trust of the athlete, but the trust of the players? What needs to be true for my athletes to understand who I am as a coach?
hmm,
And I think often about coaches like Gino Ariema, who has gone through his own evolution over the course of a very long coaching career. And I would argue Gino has never become soft. he
Mhm.
has adapted in certain ways to the changes in kids these days. And I think that part of why he's had the career in coaching that he has is because at every step of the way, he's been abundantly clear about who he is.
Right.
And so, any coach out there that's like, oh, I feel like I have to be someone I'm not, please, it's in your athlete's best interest that you are true to yourself.
Yeah.
What needs to happen often is they need to understand exactly what that is, exactly what that looks like. What does it sound like? What can they expect of you on a day to day basis or in certain situations? When they have that understanding about who you are and how you operate, now they can do their own expectation setting and how to navigate that shared space with you.
I love that. And I have heard you say this quite a few times is, what used to be a conversation has turned into an investigation. And, I hear it a lot, with parents now and the over involvement now in youth sports. Again, because there are a lot of pressure now. Kids can get paid at
Yeah.
13, 14 years old. And so with this last piece, I just wanted to talk to you about this alignment piece. How do we align our parents? How do we align coaches? How do we align our athletes to ensure that we are focusing on what's really important? And again, we always say sports is the greatest life teacher, but how do we make
Mm.
sure we align and we're actually focusing on what's important and actually teaching these life lessons and setting our kids up for the path and not clearing the path for them?
Yeah, I think it goes back to some of the skills that you've mentioned earlier in this conversation.
Yeah.
We need to be able to have conversations with parents proactively, not reactively.
Yeah.
We need to be able to ask and listen. What are their expectations?
Yeah.
What are their goals as a parent for their athlete? A lot of, especially at the youth level, especially as we're in a space where now we can monetize a young person's abilities at a younger age, thinking about the fact that parents and caregivers are largely footing the bill for a child's sport experience, especially if it's a specific sport,
Yeah.
for the duration of their time until they reach that point where they can be paid if they have that skill or ability. So, because they've made such a financial investment, they also expect a certain return on that investment, not just from
Mhm.
the performance of their athlete, but from their involvement as parents.
Right.
So I think once we start to recognize that there are certain expectations parents have today, when we're intentional about asking about those expectations, and when we're also really intentional and clear about proactively communicating to parents, here are the expectations you can have of me as your child's coach. Here's what I expect of you as parents. Here's what I expect of your athlete. Here's what your athlete can expect of me as their coach. And here's what we would love to see from your involvement as a parent. Here's also what for us and as part of this program, we can't tolerate because of the experience we're trying to create together. And
Yeah.
then just as we articulate the why with our athletes, also explaining the why with our parents. Like, I'm not going to talk to you about your child's playing time
Yeah.
because I want them to develop the skills to advocate for themselves. Because
Yeah.
again, we put it in a different context. Unless parent caregiver is going to be calling the direct report or boss of their child when their child is now in their late 20s, mid 20s, whatever it happens to be, if you're not going to do that in that space, let me as the coach help your child develop those skills now before
Yeah.
they really need them. Because at some point, even though many parents think they're operating in the best interest of their child, what they're actually doing is preventing their child from developing skills and capabilities that they're going to need at some point to operate in that space on their own.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, your co-host on Coaching Culture podcast, Nate Sanderson, I love his line, and I know he's done a blog about it. He said, "How can we turn our parents into allies, not adversaries?" And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
the thing is just like you said, is, spending the time to actually connect with our parents and let them know like they are part of this circle, right? We're not trying to force them out. Like we want them in this circle because again, we're trying to set everything up for their kids and have their kids be successful in all facets of life. But with that being said, Betsy, we're kind of running short on time. I was wondering if you had any closing thoughts, anything. And I'm big
Mm.
on environment. I'm big on experience. And again, we kind of have this slogan on our campus where we talk about we create the weather. So do you have any closing thoughts on how can we as coaches continue to create this great experience, great environment that looks beyond just the scoreboard and the tactics?
Yeah. Um, there was a phrase that came up in a conversation I had with a coach. It was nothing for him that was earth shattering, but for me, when he said it, it stuck out in my mind. And the phrase was friction creates traction.
Yeah.
And I think many of the ways that as parents, as coaches, even as athletes, we're experiencing maybe new kinds of friction or different levels of discomfort or dissatisfaction. If we can look at those in a more objective manner and be able to recognize that anytime there's friction, there's also an opportunity for forward movement.
Yeah.
And growing up in places with a lot of ice and snow, I think about, like, I know exactly what it looks and sounds like to have a tire spinning in snow.
Yeah.
You need something to grip onto if you're going to get out of that stuck place. So to be able to start to see moments of challenge or frustration, not as negative, but as an opportunity to create a new way forward. Because I think that's really where we are in sport with all of the changes that we're seeing across the landscape of sport. If we can make a shared commitment to finding a better path forward and allow the friction we currently experience in whatever capacity to be a catalyst for positive change, I think we're going to find ourselves in a better sport landscape tomorrow.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And again, thinking about when I first wanted to form this podcast, Betsy, and thinking like I need to get Betsy Butterick on here because I know how much value you add to coaches every day and being that coach's coach. So I can't thank you enough for being on today's episode. Can you tell our listeners what's the best way if they want to connect further? How can they connect with you? What are some projects you're working on? But just let our listeners know how they can connect if they want further information.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks so much for having me on, Matt. Like, it was great to reconnect with you. And I always
Yeah.
love having these conversations. And you're so intentional about the questions that you ask. So I really appreciate you creating this space for us. If folks want to know more, they can go to betsybutterick.com. You can connect to all of my social media on there. I'm mostly on Instagram. I did a brief stint on TikTok, but with two young children, it was kind of one more thing. So if you're looking for more resources, whether it's education for yourself as a coach, there's two different courses on Gen Z. There's a general course on communication called Winning with Words. But I would say Instagram and the website would be the two best places to follow the work that I'm doing now and also what's coming.
All right, Betsy. Again, I can't thank you enough. Thanks for being on the Being Champions podcast, and we will catch up soon.
All right. Thanks so much, Matt. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.